Much better. I want to start like with this kind of cool story that happened to me just a couple days ago. It's not a story really, but I was watching Joe Rogan's podcast, and
Yeah.
the I'm not going to mention who the person was, but it was a political someone who was involved in politics, let's say, and they're
Hmm.
talking about the future of AI. The useless class and other developments in politics and stuff, and especially in genetics as well. That was the main focus. You know, the in essence, he was talking about whether people should have a say in genetic engineering, and whether they will have a say or not, and how do we start the conversation, and that we should have a groundswell and all this stuff. So I actually sent this guy an email because I actually agreed. It's like, wow, I like where this guy is going. There should be more conversation in terms of technologies and politics, because these are the two sort of convergences right now. Technology has skyrocketed uh, way above and beyond economics and other sort of issues, um, as the number one topic that's important with politics, it seems. And yet nobody's really having any discussions, or nobody's even aware of these technologies. So I was wondering about what
Hmm.
you were thinking about that, because he says that on one hand, we need to have like this conversation. And then I go and I send him an email asking, hey, I totally agree. I support you, but I have some questions. How do you start this groundswell? And how do you make sure that people who have ideas and who have something important to say, how do you filter, or how do you bring that out of the groundswell? How do you like support people who have platforms to talk about this kind of stuff? How do you actually get this groundswell going other than just you yourself going around? And of course, he didn't even mention anything about my questions. All he said was, "Oh, I'm glad that you support me. This is why I'm doing this," and blah blah blah. And he was just giving me the whole political spiel. I'm like, you took time out of your day to email me back, and you're going against the very thing that you were saying that you wanted to do right away. How typical, you know?
Yeah, I mean that's a classic politician, isn't it? You
Yeah,
ask them a question, and it's just you get the script reply.
yeah.
Yeah, like now I've done the same thing with like politicians here in the UK. Like a few months ago, I went to like Westminster to talk to my local MP
Hmm.
about Brexit, and it was literally like just talking to a recording. You just heard the same thing back, and I was like, "But I'm asking you, what are you going to do?" I was like, "What are you going to do?" And he's like, "Blah blah 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 blah," and I was like, "Literally, this is it's so pointless. It's so
Yeah.
annoying." It's like people have become so kind of robotic to speaking on a script, and they're just so afraid now to kind of speak their own opinion. Like the consequences of kind of saying things that are out of line with like the party or whatever, it's too much of a risk for people now. It's
Mhm.
so frustrating. You just feel like it's way too managed, the conversation.
I, that's pretty much what everybody else has recognized in the last few years. Maybe it's always been that way to some degree, but definitely more so recently. So I'm curious, why is it that you study politics, and why you feel there's still, and like, what is it that gives you hope, and how do we expand that thing that gives you hope? You know?
What hope in wanting to make a change?
Yeah, like you still believe in the system. You still believe that the political process,
Hmm.
outside of anything revolutionary, like an actual sort of civil war or something like that,
Yeah.
that the political process still works, the structure stands. And so what is it about the political process that you would want to expose so that people can say, oh wow, you know what, if we know how to use these processes, we can do it, and they're not as obscure or abstract as we thought, and that we can overcome these kind of political sort of cemented robots.
No, it's kind of, I guess it's kind of like looking at a football game and like kind of thinking, okay, football has the same rules that it's had for God knows 100 odd years. And it's fine tuned every now and again, and you get a new like rule that's brought in or something that's modernized about the game, but the substantial game stays the same. You're just tweaking fine things. And I think that's the same thing with like the political system. There are fundamental rules of the way that the system works, and they probably will not change because it's like an equilibrium. It's kind of keeping stability. And there are some things you can change about managing the conversation and the way that parties operate, and that's all kind of moving with the times. But I think the idea of this fundamental change within politics, that people think that they go into it to radically change the system, is kind of a bit naive. I think that's how every person, like I was guilty myself. I remember when I was younger, I was like talking to people who are older. I was like, yes, we can change all these things. These are like, why not? It's so easy. And then you kind of become accustomed to the reality of the situation, that, you know, this is the way it works. It is the rules of the system. And yes, now and again, people come along and they do something slightly different. You look at Donald Trump, yeah, but he's also conforming to the rules of the game. He just talks a bit louder.
Doesn't he break some of the rules as well, though?
Not
Or,
really.
you know?
He's operating in the same system, isn't he? He just talks in a different way, but he's still using the same system to get democratically elected and to talk to his electorate as well. He's using social media, which is that new. It's kind of like the analogy I was saying about football. Social media is like that slightly different tweak that's happened to the same game, and Donald Trump was able to benefit from that. But he's still working within the same logics that have existed for quite a while now in politics, in Western democracies anyway. So as like someone that studies politics, you get excited by the idea that you can influence change, but I think you would be very naive if you think that you would go in and be able to radically change everything, because that's pretty impossible.
Yeah, I mean, can we establish right off the bat, without needing to go in depth, that, you know, if you're going to change a system, then that's not playing by the rules. That's an entirely different system of beliefs. So, and then where do you draw those parallels or those lines? Like, you know, if you're going to do something about today's problems, today's issues, you want to have political activity, you know, you have to accept the rules of the game. And if you don't accept the rules of the game, then you're not really talking about, you know, influencing politics or doing anything good. You're talking about, you know, switching systems, and that's a whole other ball game, right?
Yeah, you're talking about a revolution. If you're going in and you want to if you come in with communist ideas, you're talking about a revolution. And we're not in that place in the world, and the society is not in that place right now where a revolution could be galvanized. A lot of people are still behind the idea of liberal democracies. Yes, they don't like the way that politicians are operating right now, and maybe the economic system could be tweaked, but that you'd struggle to find a country that in the West where people are really advocating for the whole system to change, because it's too radical.
Well, that this is in Europe, though, right? I mean, I don't, because again, we need to talk.
This is Europe, but equally, this is also America as well.
From what I see, is it the polarization there is, especially with my generation and Generation Z. They wear Karl Marx T-shirts and hammer and sickle signs, and like they want to change the system. A lot of people are sort of going towards that communism type thing. And then on the other side, I don't know how much fascism is really making a comeback. I mean, in Germany here, the AfD started I think they're in the running.
Bundestag, yeah, they're the biggest opposition now.
Yeah, so, you know, I don't know if you could call them fascists, really, if they're, I don't know much about the European politics, but the world is polarizing. So it seems like we're not talking about, you know, dealing with the issues. We're talking about this structural change or desire for structural change here in the world anyway. Would you agree?
Yeah, partly. I think the polarization of people is partly because of the collapse of the center ground. That's not to do with there being a radical change going on in the background. It's simply to do with the fact that the liberal politics of the center no longer are functioning, and they don't really have the answers. So people are splitting to the left and the right. This has happened many a times before in history in Western democracies, and we're just in that cycle where that will eventually return. The center ground will eventually come back, because that it, again, using that the word equilibrium, like the political system is in equilibrium, and it will always naturally return back to that stable position. And right now, yes, it is going to the left and the right, and people do fear that a little bit, but the center ground will eventually return once it kind of gets its act together again.
Yeah, no, see, now this is interesting because I mean, I haven't really thought about this and by that perspective yet. So what you're saying is, if I can, I don't know if that's what you're saying, but I want to know if this is what you're saying, if I could clarify it, that although the world seems like it's polarizing but it doesn't necessarily mean that there there is a structural change coming or some kind of revolution or some kind of apocalyptic sort of scenario. This
Mm-hmm.
is almost just noise because of the social media, and these people don't actually have any impact in the actual process of
Yeah.
politics that much. So I want to know if to what degree you believe that, and I'm going to challenge it with other politicians such as, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, for example. I don't know if you know her that
Yeah.
much, but she is one of these sort of. She seems kind of like, she's getting a lot of a following. She's getting some political power. She's very young, quite
Mm-hmm.
naive in my opinion, but nonetheless is part of the system and is influencing things. And her policies are very, very left leaning. I mean, extreme to the degree where I would say she's a hair's breadth away from being, communist.
Yeah, I mean, I hate kind of using Donald Trump all the time, but he's a classic case of this populist movement. And populism is not specific to the right, but it's also left wing as well. Like, it's galvanizing these
Absolutely.
ideas that are
Trudeau,
not
my
that.
Canada is that way.
Yeah,
That way, yeah.
and these people kind of run on feelings and don't really run on policies. And Donald Trump obviously was a populist movement and populist candidate, but would you say him now, as the president of the United States, he's acting in a populist manner? Because to me, his policies that he's passed through or attempted to pass through are pretty standard for a Republican
Mhm.
president. So populists make all this noise and they use it to get into power, but once they are in power, they also kind of conform to, again, these rules of the game. And then they become standardized to it, and then their movement changes. Italy, the Five Star Movement, making so much noise, and then as soon as it got into power, its policies almost flipped back
Mhm.
to the standard politics of Italy. And in France, Marine Le Pen, her movement, everyone thinking that she was going to make a huge impact in the presidential elections, and then Macron wins at like 65% or something, a landslide almost. So I don't know. It's kind of, populism is something that we are going through, but it's also something that we have been through many times before. And
Yeah.
yes, it has sometimes resulted in serious political problems. For example, the Nazis in Germany, but um,
Can you clarify
the
that? The Nazis, what is that?
well,
Oh, the not
they
Nazis?
the Nazis were a populist movement. They got into
Yeah.
power democratically using the systems that were in place at the time.
Are you talking
Um,
about this aside from World War II? Because I know that I don't know if that there was much of a.
Aside from World War II, yeah, I mean, they got into power. They were elected into power. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it wasn't as if they were kind of, holding hostage to people, and they rode off the fears and the feelings of the Great Depression and the
Yeah.
economic problems, and then they got into power, which is kind of what is happening now. It's it's the fallout from the 2008 global recession, the economic problems that are chronic in a lot of countries, not just Western countries, but also in Asia and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
populists are able to use those genuine problems that people
Just
have
throwing the
in
dice
order,
in the air.
and
Yeah.
they kind of make, and on the left and the right, people on the left do the same thing, people on the right do the same thing, and they use that to kind of be like, oh yeah, I'm relating to that, because that is something that I've noticed. I've noticed that my wages have gone down over the past 5 years. I've noticed that I'm not able to go on. I only go on one holiday a year instead of three.
Mm.
And that's how these people are able to gain the support that they have. But at the same time, you have to be very skeptical that we might be over exaggerating this populist movement, because it's not really resulting in a lot of countries. It's not really resulting in them having any substantial power.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, the media gives them a lot of attention because it's a good story, and they put it on the agenda, and then that makes people think about it more. But in terms of the reality of the situation, there's not many countries that you can actually say there's a populist government that has, even if they are in power, has the clear majority in order to implement all the policies they want to do. Most of the time, they're kind of supported or propped up. So, and then that's when they then resort to the rules of the game, because they're unable to actually implement the policies they want. So they have to kind of become more center ground in order to govern.
Yeah, I'm very inclined to agree with you there. Okay, so that's a good segue into maybe looking at the past versus the future. Because so in the past, like you said, this kind of populism uprising, and then you have like the throw of the dice in the air just to see what comes back down. Whoever gains power politically, they sort of shift back towards things being normalized. But it's clear that in the past it's happened that, you know, some unlucky chance for some reason, like with the Nazis in World War II, when the dice did come back down, it was the wrong person to, you know, to get that power, and it just the climate was right to change the system and to cause all this trouble. So how much of that World War II political kind of, because especially being here in Germany, I mean, I've been here for 3 months and a half now, and all I ever hear and like see are things that are related to World War II and to fascism and to, I mean, I was reading this newspaper because I'm trying to learn German, right? I'm going to school for it. And it's called Die Straße der Zucker, which is like the street of sugar. Anyway,
yeah.
And it's like a super like Antifa, even with my level of German, which is admittedly kind of low. I mean, I'm reading all these phrases and sentences, and it's just like they're saying super, you know, they're talking about World War II, and the fact it's like they believe that they're still in the 60s, and the like aftermath of like the trying to quell the Nazis are still kind of in government back after the war. So it's like, man, these guys are living in a whole other past world. So how much of the politics of the past is a sort of culprit here, versus also I'm going to bring your attention to the future, whereas, you know, China, because again, this whole thing really started off with the idea that technology is what's influencing politics. And China's advances in technology and their implementation of it in their economics and in their sociological system, right, which is literally controlling people and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they're the next superpower. It's very clear. So, you know, they're having their hands here and there. They're building this thing called the what do they call it? The belt, I guess, and the Marine Silk Road as well.
Yeah, the Silk Belt.
Yeah, so the Silk Belt, and it's so like they're really going to be taking control of major countries, a lot of whom used to be communists, so they're naturally aligned with the Chinese sort of politics, and so in the future, the influence of this new superpower on the world stage, you know, versus all this sort of past political kind of influence, where are we in the center, and what's going to happen? I mean, you know.
Well, so
I think it's you're frozen there, so hold on.